Okay, so recording should be working. Welcome everybody. This is the second set. What? It's a moment. Apparently, the recording doesn't want to. No. Just a moment. Let me just share this. Let's again.
It seems to me that the recording is on, but I don't know.
You mean it's not being recorded?
No, it seems to be fine.
For some reason I didn't get the work. Now it's working. So welcome everybody to the second course session. I am Jaime Jimenez, and together is with Marco Tiloca, we are the chairs of the working group. Today, the session, we assume, as always, that people have been reading the drafts and are aware of the latest and greatest in the working group. We also, well, as you know, we are having this remote participation, and we will be using, sorry, first the IPR. So the note well applies to this core session, and well, you should be aware of that note well that is defined in RFC 8179. It also contains some guidelines that kind of tell us a bit on the behavior. So let's try to be nice as well, and all the IPR considerations. So, yeah, another point is that we will have the remote session. So as you know, there is the Jabber where you can ask for queuing. We are not that many people, so it might be that you can just, politely just jump in, especially later on as we have a discussion. It will depend. So let's see how it goes on the discussion session. I assume you all know how to use the queue bot that we have in the Jabber. If not, you can use also the WebEx. So the Thursday session has a bit on, you can see there, the topics, and we will have a bit on discovery topics and on some new drafts on link, a new link relation for implementation information, and then some resource directory updates. Then we will have a Coral and in general core applications discussion. There at 1:45 we will have that's a new thing that we are trying out, which is more having a bit more debate in the group for technical decision making. And then finally we will have the CNML cluster. So I think I didn't forget anything. So without further ado, let's start. In order not to waste time, let's start. I think it was 101. Yes. And you're in.
Good afternoon or good morning. The agenda has been shuffled around a little bit, so I wasn't exactly expecting to do this one first, but we can do that. So a while ago in the Think2Think research group, we had been discussing the situation that right now it's really hard to find diagnostic information for implementations that are out there. I wrote a draft, and people seem to generally like it, but we weren't quite sure whether there's enough energy here that we actually should be pushing this forward. And it seems to me that we actually have this energy now. Next slide. Yeah, the observation is in the HTTP world, we have things like server and user agent that are essentially sent with every request and every response, actually the other way around. So you always know what kind of implementation you are talking to at the other end. In the core world, that would be not generally an acceptable strategy. So we are not currently providing any information right now. And the idea is that since we already have the discovery mechanism, we might use it here as well. So we might want to make the information that would normally be in the server header field in HTTP available through discovery. And well-known core is kind of the natural place for that. Now, we wouldn't usually want to put the actual information there, but would provide a link like all the other resources that are described in well-known core. And if that is the case, then we probably need an appropriate link relation type. And there are lots of link relation types out there. Next slide, please. But there's not really one that fits this specific application. Defining link relation types should be a relatively lightweight thing to do. So I just went ahead and wrote a couple of paragraphs for a link relation type I called impl info. Well, it could have been implementation information, but then we would always waste that space in well-known core. So I called it impl info. And that is meant for links that point to implementation information. Now, the draft does not currently propose to define media types for what this could point to. We could do that later. So we can start using this before we have these media types defined, which might be a bigger effort. Or we could actually think, well, for instance, HTML is a great media type for having descriptions of implementation information out there. So again, the proposal is not to define these media types now. There's, of course, also concern that adding more to well-known core might help those people who are using well-known core for DDoS. So there's a little bit of text in there that discusses that point and reinforces that you really should be using the mitigation that is defined in RFC 7252. Next slide. So the previous slide should be the end of my presentation, but one interesting point that came up is that there is an activity going on defining something called security.txt, and it's highly controversial because clearly this can be used in a stupid way, and it also can be abused in interesting ways. But on the other hand, it also has upside. So there are people proposing going forward with this document, and as far as I remember, it's in ISG last call right now. Not sure. Haven't checked this week. So we might want to do something like security.txt for this space, because security.txt itself is not the right thing. It's meant for websites. It's meant for pet websites, so websites that are maintained by people and where people are looking at and so on. So what we are doing here is more like a kettle kind of thing. Anyway, so there are various kinds of information that would go into such a security.txt, and we would have to find a way to merge that information or to point to multiple sources and so on. So again, I'm proposing not to tackle this at the moment, but of course we should discuss this. So please discuss.
Yep, and I see in the queue already, Michael, so go ahead, please.
I think this is a great idea, Karsten. I mostly agree with your comments about security text. Maybe the format that security text has proposed is something to consider other than for HTML. I'm concerned about HTML because I don't think we really want to have someone embed JavaScript and stuff into it. And so I'm concerned about that. So if you were going to pick something, then I would say you should pick CBOR, JSON, But the other thing that we might want to consider, or this document might want to provide as a separate tag, is to have a MUD RFC 8520 URL, which often will tell you lots about the implementation as well.
All right, that's interesting. Christian, you're in the queue as well.
Yeah, so I really think we should have this in there, and I don't think that pinning down any of the content of the media types doesn't really matter, because this is something that can be changed after this is rolled out. And one reason I think we should, one reason why I think we should have this is that if co-op is abused to do things like amplification because implementations get things wrong, this can easily reflect badly on the protocol as such. And if we get more implementations to ship implementation info, at least about their libraries or about their product, this can be used to actually find the offending implementations and make sure that they have upgrade plans on mitigation in place.
And Christian, you are referring to the link, to this link relation, not to the security.txt, right?
I'm referring to this link relation, yes. I'm unfamiliar with the details of security.txt, so I can't really comment on that. But from a very high level point of view, it looks like something that would be a discussion behind it around which content format and which information should be there. But the device itself shouldn't probably have any more information than I am this, and for any implementation information, just see there.
Very good.
And
Sorry.
to be clear, implementation information here would be if I run a libcoop server somewhere, then it would point to the libcoop homepage. So it doesn't seem to help if I want to know whose fault it is for the amplification attack, because it's not the libcoop developers, right?
It's probably it's at least the documentation of libcoop. So it might be something that's built upon it that is not declared, but at least it's some information. And I'd expect regular applications that are built on libraries to override their library's default of I'm something based on libcoop to I'm this particular application.
Klaus, I mean, just because you are discussing, do you have anything else on that, or?
No, it's an interesting topic. Sounds useful to have, and I think there are lots of interesting questions around this. So having some discussions is useful.
Okay. Then going back to the queue. One question I have for Karsten on the security.txt, other than the hiring information that maybe is not so relevant, is at the end of the day, it's just a list of emails of who are the security those responsible for the security of, in the case of IoT, that particular IoT device. So you mentioned at some point that it will depend a lot. It will depend a lot on the deployment use case, and who is. I mean, how do you envision this? Is it something that the management company of the devices or the manufacturer of the device has to provide, or how is it done? Because that will change everything. And also considering MUDs, that's also done during the is something that is supposed to be at the factory. So the deployment scenarios matter for the security.txt. And then to the link relation, I also agree with Christian in general. So, or with you and Christian. So.
Okay, so this really was about implementation information, not about deployment information.
But I mean for the security.txt, it will have information about those responsible for the security of the specific endpoint. If somebody finds a vulnerability, so who are those? I mean, wouldn't it make a difference if it is those owning the device or deploying the device, or because it could be different companies?
Yes. So I would like to separate implementation information, which might give you a pointer for who wrote the code, from deployment information, which gives you might give you information on who forgot to properly configure the firewall or something like that. And right now, I'm not sure that we will get very far with deployment information. And we can think about that, but typically people who commission devices will not be very successful in putting deployment information in there. Well, maybe we can invent something for that, but I was hoping that this really is something that can be set at the factory, like MUD can be. And I have a question for Michael, who's next in the queue. So what is the relationship between this and MUD? Would I have I already have some MUD stuff going on in the DHCP or whatever the device uses to gain access to the network. Now, how is the MUD information? How would you expect somebody who's out there in the internet to use that MUD information, and what is the chain of accesses that would lead that someone to that?
Michael?
Yeah. So it the MUD URL, even if you couldn't retrieve it at all, would essentially allow you to fingerprint the device and therefore know, and probably by examining the URL, you would know who built it. It's much more interesting than I think that it contains libcoap. I got in the queue because I wanted to say I would strongly want to discourage libcoap from answering this by default with saying libcoap version, because I think I really think we want to have something about who uses it, not which library it is. But I could be persuaded otherwise. I think, Carsten, that so you could put the MUD URL in DHCP, yeah, which doesn't work at all when you have IPv6 RA only, so you're never going to get that information. So that's an interesting place where something could come and ask the device. A MUD controller could ask the device, well, who are you there? And we can have implementation information, and we've talked about having COSWIDs in the MUD file. And we could have a lot of detail, and it doesn't have to be in the device necessarily, just by reference. Does that answer your question? Sure.
Yes, I was just thinking about what expectations we are creating here. So given that a MUD file really is a declaration from a device to its surrounding network environment, it may not accurately describe how that device actually looks like on the outside. So I'm not sure that the MUD URL is always very useful for someone who's trying to find out what's going on with the web implementation over there in the network.
Guys,
Well, I think
with Michael before,
point.
because
Yeah.
just a second. This is very interesting, but we really have a tight schedule. And I think Marco just mentioned that we are several minutes behind. So if that's okay, let's put a pin on this. I think the presentation was nice. I don't think we are asking for adoption or anything like that at the moment, right, Carsten? Or are you, actually?
Well, actually, I think if we have agreement that we don't have to do the media type right now, then I think I would ask for adoption.
Okay. Very good. I would say okay, I see that at least there is 2 people in the Jabber that will be in favor of that. I would suggest let's take it to the mailing list. Let's not do it right now.
No.
And if we have sufficient people on the mailing list that are positive and discussion also goes on there, we will consider the adoption. All right.
Good.
Thank you. So let's move to Christian. Sorry for the delay, by the way. Can anybody see anything? I don't know why the presentation is so small. Sorry.
You might want to zoom in a bit.
The thing is that I don't know if I can actually. Let me check. Is it better now?
Yes.
All right, great. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'll try to make this quick. This is not really a document presentation because it touches on a document that Carsten has written some time ago. But it's really more about a topic that I'd like to warm up the discussion about, how we as a working group want to go forward with this. The main theme is unsolicited responses. That is, you send something happened some time ago, and then the server decides to send a client a response where the client probably knows from some context or something in the message that what it's a response to, even though it didn't explicitly request it. Now there is precedent. Next slide, please. There's some precedent for this already in the core protocol. I mean, observation does this on a very fundamental level. Multicast responses are a bit related because they don't arrive from the original address, but this has come up over and over again in different applications. So Carsten's draft mentions triangle setups where request is sent, but the device expects the response over different transport. Something like this was also in co-op over SMS. Some time ago, there was talk about blocks to transfer with larger window sizes. DOTS recently requested something similar, and it could be used for cache pre-population just as well. And last but not least, the multicast notifications I talked about last time. They do something very similar. They say, suppose you sent that request, and now you're getting the responses to this. The crux of the thing is always the tokens. So for observations, it works there because there was a prior request, and some of those cases could probably profit from a similar setup, where we say that, okay, because there is this and that condition, there can be multiple response on that token. Some suggestions are also out there about out of message layer, about some agreement between client and server about what tokens could be used. So like request sending a lease with it. So, and by the way, please, for further responses, use tokens from to. And of course, you can always, and that's what the core responses draft does, is introduce options that change the rules about tokens. So for example, let's say the token doesn't matter, I'm just a response, and this is what it's about. I think we should continue this work in some way and not just leave it to all the messages. Yeah, responding to the question from Jabber, what requests I envision here? Yes, I envision primarily get and fetch requests. So it could probably, yeah, it could probably work with other types as well. But then then those on an application level still need to be side effect free, because it's usually suppose you send a post request with this and that payload, then I would now be responding with that payload. So that's a bit fuzzier. So I think it makes sense to primarily think about get and fetch requests in the first place. What do you think? What should we do about this?
I mean, what is the document is currently expired, right?
Expired, yes, by a year or more.
Yeah. So Carsten, what is the plan? Oh, sorry.
The document actually opens up a number of alternatives, and I think Christian has pointed out that there is one alternative that actually might be low-hanging fruit here. And I agree that this is probably an approach that could be used. I think the hard part here will not be defining the actual protocol, but defining the context and the usage that we actually envision for it. So I think we need some more discussion there, but I would be happy to pick up that discussion again and to create a more targeted document specifically on this one alternative.
Okay. And on the DOTS case, is this coming also from someone from DOTS, by the way? Not aware of this.
Yeah, we had there was a mail on the dots and core mailing list recently about we are observing a block 1 and we want to get the block 2 a first block, and we want to get follow-up blocks through again through just as well, because our back channel might be clogged. So we just want to send out everything and hope for the best, and then they can still selectively get missing parts.
Well, I mean, let's see. I guess. Oh yes. Sorry, Göran. Go ahead.
Just a question. Carsten mentioned one option here. How does this relate to what's discussed in the multicast notifications? Would it use the same idea as there, or would this be a separate draft that is referenced by the multicast notification? How do they? What is the proposal?
Yeah, that's a good part of the discussion. So the multicast notification relies on actually having a token defined for that. So it's a more efficient way of doing this, while this here is something that's maybe more useful for out of the blue stuff. And again, we should be discussing the contexts and the usages that we have in mind, and maybe at the end we find out that the multicast case actually is the one that is most useful, and we are not going to do the other ones. On the block 2 thing, yes, we designed block 2 to be slow, and if we need something that works under attack, which is what the dots people need, we might want to craft something specifically for this use case. I'm not sure that this will actually be of general use, because there's probably a need to actually play loose and fast with the congestion control rules.
I think that there's congestion control rules. There's kind of 3 topics. There's congestion control rules, there is token usage, and there is message semantics. And I think all of them need to be tackled, but largely they would be orthogonal.
So I sense we do have some energy here. So let's continue the discussion on the list and try to come up with a scheme where the 3 things somehow fit in, not necessarily with the same solution.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. Let's continue on the list and see what is the outcome of that one. Let's move on to the next topic, which is the RD.
Yep, still me. So a brief update on resource directory status. Next slide, please. The -24 has been published with all the things that we discussed in IETF 106. Most importantly of those is that now we have this very minimal subset of RD, DNSSD interaction explicitly written out there. So the RD can be discovered over DNSSD, and you've probably read the rest of the changelog. We've received 2 reviews in the ISG process already from Sectier and GenArt. And I'll go in the next slides over the smaller to larger problems that will need addressing in some way. Next slide, please. So the simple stuff is already being processed and largely has pull requests on GitHub. That's easy. Next slide, please. A bit harder is the topic of DDoS mitigation. We should probably say something in here again. From my point of view, it should largely be sufficient to it should largely be sufficient to refer to what is already prescribed by RFC 7252 and the updates in Echo Request Tag that say that there is a recommended way of doing this amplification mitigation. I'm not sure whether we should really say something explicitly about what is coming up now, or whether we can just rely on whatever this 7252 is being updated to. Related to that topic is something that came up basically when I processed the input from Adam Montville. That is, simple registrations probably have something that we should take into consideration. That is, a simple registration can be started from a unicast from a request with a fake address, and that would possibly leak information. I could take questions now because Carsten's in the queue.
Carsten, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that from a procedural point of view, so we don't create a dependency, it's sufficient for us to point to the DDoS mitigation text in 7252. And Echo will add a second way, which actually can be combined if you really want to. But we don't have to wait for that.
Okay.
So the mitigation in 7252 actually works, even if it is a little bit inefficient.
Okay. Thanks.
Were not some of the security considerations related to the authorization as well? Or was it only DDoS?
Yeah, next that would be next slide.
Okay.
I'll come to that. But stay here, please, for a moment. So it's just.
Sorry.
And the last, probably easy, but we still have to get it right, point is we have a section in there about endpoints picking their names randomly. Russ's point here was that, yeah, it should be sufficient that we have size here, but maybe it's not so. We should get an impression of what do we really need that, and if we need it, how do we get it right in the first place? Hammer?
Yeah, so the endpoint name used as identifier for anything in practice, because my understanding was that it was the security context that was used to identify the endpoint when it registers.
From the resource directory's point of view, it looks at the security context, but clients clients that from lookup may or may not, depending on the application, put some meaning to the endpoint names. And if they do, they hopefully do this on a resource directory that enforces any meaning in them. This is for cases where no meaning is assigned there.
And here, when you say guidance might on site might suffice, but what other options are there? Like in Lightweight and TWEM, no, actually, forget Lightweight and TWEM. Anyways, the point is that do you suggest that it is the RD somehow assigning some hash to the endpoint name and not allowing, because remember that we have this URN draft on that is basically the endpoint will potentially could use these URNs that it decides. So I mean, like the endpoint name will be picked by the device registering. Christian, I don't hear you.
Sorry, I was muted. Okay. Yeah, this is exactly about the case where the client picks the random identifier, but the client will still need to know basically how long that random identifier needs to be in order to work. So if this thing with the URNs is coming up, that might be something we can put in there, and because we know that URNs never collide, we'll never run into trouble. So that's exactly what I'm asking for here. Is it good enough if we just put something in there, or do we want to think this through more thoroughly? And if the URNs is already something that is coming up from another side and that's being thought through there, then probably put a random URN in there is good enough for here. Next slide, please. The harder part, and especially the part where I'm asking the working group for a bit more input, is the interaction with endpoint names derived from certificate details. So there's this common name field, and we've only recently put a bit more text in there that says that how this can be used and what makes it unique. But turns out this wasn't all correct. So if someone is experienced in where all those fields in X509 certificates come from, and how they could be used, it would really be helpful if we could sit down with someone and talk this through about what can actually be used to work from a certificate. And not yet on the slides, but it came up kind of in parallel is the general question of what do we want to prescribe in terms of security policies. So right now there are a few suggestions of what the security policies can look like, but there's no too concrete guidance. So my question that I'd like to add here is, do we want to do something in a separate document later on that describes how a security policy of an RD could be managed, what it could look like, how this exactly relates to ACE, and do we need to know anything about this now for this document? Carsten?
Yeah, so I kind of didn't pay attention when this entered the discussion, and I think it's completely misguided to have anything in this document that talks about certificates at all. I think I'm also not particularly happy about doing a separate document later, but maybe there's a reason to do that. I think the underlying problem here is that the resource directory actually is a protocol that can be used by a set of applications, and each of these applications have different authorization requirements. It's not the purpose of this document to define those applications, and so we are not going to get to a situation where we can say much about the authorization considerations. I mean, it's like as if HTTP was going to define how a web application actually runs its database with usernames in it and so on. No, you don't do that. That's the application that defines that. So we should focus on the things where the protocol actually interacts with something. And I'm not even sure that we need to have X509 in there at all. So we have things like ACE where we actually even can carry around X509 stuff if we want to. But resource directory should be free of this stuff.
Personally, I'm happy to rip it out, but there were questions about the authorization model that we probably might need to still need to answer, but maybe differently in the sense that we just say, okay, this is really up to the application, and we can't give guidance because
there are people who have the SNMP scars. So SNMP v3 actually came with various authorization models over time, and basically the idea was that in a network you would have a situation where the network management would somehow provide an overall authorization scheme, and any single agent would be able to plug into that. But I think that's not at all the deployment idea we have for resource directories. So just like CoAP, which interfaces to a number of SDOs, very, very different ways of doing authorization and even authentication. I think we should not tie a resource directory any specific one of those.
Okay, if I can just jump in, maybe to summarize the discussion, I guess we have some opinions in the Jabber as well. Those have been reflected in the ETHPAD. I don't think we are trying to add another 20 pages of how to do ACE with resource directory in the resource directory document, right? Nobody's trying to do that, as far as I know. So I guess maybe short paragraphs on guidance, because right now there is nothing on no pointers, I believe, to how to do that, how to do authorization. So maybe like small text on how, like pointers to relevant documents, and perhaps later on down the road, because this has popped up in other areas and in other discussions, how to use RD and ACE together. It could be something that could be done in Thing or in LWIC or elsewhere, right? If those who want to do it are still interested, but maybe not on this particular document, I believe. Alexei, you commented on the chat. I would like to have, because the main comments left are yours. So if you could just manifest yourself and say your current thoughts, and also Barry, who is expecting some resolution to this.
I really need to read the current text because I don't currently remember. Yeah, but I can do it like within a couple of days or something.
And from my part, I have nothing in particular. I'm just watching the discussion and waiting for it to resolve. So
very good. So let's try to come up with some text there. I think we have a general agreement. So I hope the minutes were taken somewhere. My Etherpad is not working very well. So let's move on to the next one, which is also related to RD. So Christian.
Yes, and this is all the things that should really not slow down resource directory, because they can, next slide, please. So things we can do in a resource directory, but we don't specify, next slide, please, in the main document, because we don't need to, because we have extension points, and next slide, please. And it might also be helpful here to explain how to build on resource directory in other documents. What I've written for this is a document that's really, next slide please, a mixed bag of things that could be tacked onto a resource directory. So one topic, just run through them briefly. One topic is reverse proxying. A device wants to register at the resource directory but doesn't even have a public address that it can properly use, so just asks the resource directory to make one up and put that in instead of the actual address. Think turn a bit. Especially for those cases, you might also want to have infinite lifetimes, because hey, you have a TCP connection open, and as long as that's open, the registration is good. There's also a few points in there that are kind of being obsolete by Coral, because I put in something about querying the resource directory by fetching, also by following also some relations. This is so much cleaner with Coral that I'm basically pulling back that suggestion. Some points are in there that can be used for replication. So if you have multiple resource directories that want to give a consistent view, they need a bit more information. Zone identifier introspection is about the administrator wanting to look at the resource directory, even though it contains things that it can't express outside of the local link. And it's not like you would be going around SSHing into devices to introspect things. If you're an administrator, you might really want to see your eyes with a Ethernet 0 or something in it. I'll skip over multicast aggregation because it's covered by the multicast proxy proposal as well. And opportunistic RD is something that I kind of think we'll see anyway in some situations where devices want to have an RD and are large enough to ship one, at least for a few registrations, so that clients don't need to fall back to multicast discovery. I'm pretty sure we've built something like this at IETF at some point in time. So probably experience from there could be gathered in. The point is, this is a document that contains a bunch of suggestions, some of which might be interesting to the working group. And I'd like to hear whether any of this is interesting enough that people want to join in working on this, or at least express an interest that keeps me active on them to make this go forward. Next slide, please. There's a few documents that are not, a few ideas that are not in this document, but kind of similar because they're also describing RD extensions. I mean, RDAD and SSD is the obvious example. Coral Reef, I already mentioned RD replication, and protocol negotiation plays a bit into it, even though it needs to work without resource directory. It does have aspects of querying one that will be extensions to an RD. And when 1.5 years ago, the group membership in the group concept of RD was overhauled, we might have lost a few use cases that could also be specified in a separate document. Next slide, please. So of those things, what is the interest? What is something there is interest for? Are there particular things that you think are very important, well, that should not be followed? Yeah, questions, please. Ideas, anything. Hannah?
I can admit it. Well, for us, some of the points you had there, actually, I think will be taken or will continue in the next section, actually, when we talk about the Coral, for example, on the application side. But I have been seeing some requirements coming from OMA. I don't know if we have the language end-to-end Fox in the call at the moment. I don't see it, but some of the RD requirements were there. A lot of the interesting stuff that I'm more interested in, at least for resource directory, has to do with doing complex queries for the lookup interface. I don't know if you had that in this list.
Yeah, that's things like relation following, but that's probably better done with Coral Reef because the query basically RD extends the query interface of 6690, and that is reaching its limits within RD. So doing anything more complex is better done with Coral.
And I was also, I mean, particularly in my case, I'm interested, not in this document, actually, it's the distributed RD that you started at some point. That one is still interesting for me, but I haven't had time to work on it. And the last two items in this list, the multicast aggregation, also sounded interesting, but I haven't dedicated enough time to contribute. I don't know if others in the call would like to pitch in as well on potential topics. But and also, by the way, I'm thinking that maybe this could be interesting for part of one of the future interim sessions that we will have, virtual meetings that we will be having at the end of the month, starting at the end of the month. So any would like to comment something, feel free. So thank you, Christian, very much. Let's then continue with the, what is this? With the next session, next part, so which has to do with applications. I think actually right now, Klaus, is where you have to start presenting. Stop sharing and
There's my unmute button.
Yep. So go ahead and start sharing. You have a few minutes. Try to, because we are way behind schedule, like plus 20 minutes behind. So if you could summarize, that would be great.
Yes. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. The first item is about a draft that does not exist yet, but we discussed about this in Singapore and I think also in Montreal already. So this is a quick reminder of what we agreed then and the status update. And the status update can be done quickly because nothing has happened yet since then. So what will we talk about? This is on the one hand about link format, where we use these link attributes like RT and CT and so on. And we have a hackMD somewhere where Jaime started collecting all the link attributes that are used in different documents. But we don't have any official IAMA registry or anything like that for those link attributes. And then on the other hand, we have on IAMA our core parameters. So the co-op methods and resource types and response codes and all of those. And I'm planning to write a new draft that we already have discussed in one of the interims, where I want to clarify the expert review guidelines for those registries that we have. And so what we said in Singapore was, let's use this draft also to create a new registry for the link attributes. But yeah, as I said, nothing has happened on that draft yet due to lack of time. Any questions or comments on this?
Well, I can comment that I would find it useful, at least. And that's why I started collecting them in a document. It seems to be a recurring problem.
So we said it's useful, but not urgent, and that's why the progress is a bit slow.
And this will be basically an informational draft, right? Experimental, no, informational, sorry.
Yes. So I would want to clarify the expert review guidelines, but maybe we also want to change some of the allocation policies, but that's still informative, right?
Yeah, I think so.
But yeah, no protocol changes, just adjustments of the registries and the definition of a new registry for link attributes.
So maybe, I don't know if the group is up to date with this topic, but I would like to hear, especially if there is any particularly negative opinions, because it might be that we have overseen some issues with this idea. So basically, the idea would be like to have a registry also of existing link relations. Is it right? Is Jabber working? Everything fine? So
I think we have discussed this at the last two IETFs, and what we should do now is have a document, take a look at it, and then of course there will be a working group adoption call at some point, and then we should make sure that this is the right stuff to have in the document.
Yeah, just to be clear, we are not. I mean, this should be a small document, and it's more for clarifications than creating. All right, Alexei, sounds okay. Very good. So then let's do that. I would say that we can start working on this. Maybe by the next IETF have something already written. Thank you.
That would be nice. Then on to one of our working group documents, the href draft, which is about our constrained version of URIs. And just as a very quick update on what happened since the last IETF, there have been 2 new revisions of the draft. The first one only had one small change, and the larger update was on the -03. Due to time constraints in this meeting, I won't go through this list. But the changes -03 were quite substantial. Lots of clarifications, much more details on supported schemes, creation, normalization, and comparison. So there's a lot of new stuff, good stuff in there that now might be useful if people take a look. There are a few open issues that might lead to some breaking changes potentially. And so I guess we need one more update, one new revision before we have an implementation version. But I think that then would be a good opportunity to ask people to give it a try and then implement it. And maybe we can have a small interop event in an interim meeting. I have 2 issues that I would like to highlight if time permits. And maybe that's more interesting than going through this entire list of things that have changed. Any questions or comments on this slide? Okay, then first issue. And that was an interesting discussion with Jim and Christian. And I noticed that when we write URIs or our constrained versions of URIs, we always have a bit of overhead. So if we look at this example URI, then we of course have these different URI components. And so we have some data like coop and example.com and foo and so on. And then there are in between some delimiters, so colons and slashes. And this is overhead, but it's necessary overhead, because if there weren't any delimiters, then we couldn't figure out where one of those components starts and where the component ends. So we need to have these bytes between the components that separate them in some way. But of course, if we can minimize the overhead, so express the same information, but with fewer bytes in between, that would be very useful. So if we do this in Corel, and we use CBOR and we have a URI, then we would have a CBOR a text string that's major type 23. And this URI has 49 bytes because we have this very long path segment at the end. And so we use additional information 24 and this 1 extra byte 49 to have the length. And in total, we would have 44 bytes for the components and 7 bytes for these delimiters and the initial coem CBOR prefix, which are 7 bytes. So 7 bytes of overhead. And the question is, can we minimize this overhead? And if we now look at how it's currently done in the href draft, we also have these components. And each component or subcomponent is similar to coop, where we have options. So there's an option number and an option value length, and then that's followed by the value itself. And in CBOR, we would encode the option number as an unsigned integer. So that's major type 0 and additional information 0 for option number 0. And for the scheme here, it's a text string, so major type 3, and length is 4. And the whole thing we are wrapping in a CBOR array. There are 8 elements for components, and in each component has one unsigned integer for the option number, and then the value itself with the initial byte. So again, we have 44 bytes of data, but 10 bytes of overhead. So in this point, the CBOR encoding actually does not help to make this very concise. So I was thinking, can we maybe improve on this somehow? And one thing we could do is we could throw away the overhead that is generated by CBOR. That's these type indications for the unsigned integer and the text strings. Because if we know the option number, we also know the type. So we could combine the option number and the option value length into a single byte, 3 bits for the number and 5 bits for the length. And so we only have 4 bytes for the 4 components. And then we wrap the whole thing in a CBOR byte array. So we have, in the end, 44 bytes of data and 6 bytes of overhead. What do you think? It's all Jim's fault. He said that we are now looking to save every single byte we can.
So I'm not sure the queuing system. It actually does work. Yeah, we have this RFC called 7252, which gives us a really nice encoding of multiple options. So maybe we could use that. I'm wondering if that actually is worth adding more decoding and encoding stuff to what's already in CBOR. So I think that has to be carefully balanced. But yeah, I mean, that format we came up with for CoAP is pretty good.
So you wouldn't have major concerns about not using CBOR inside there?
Well, again, it's more work, and we should decide whether it's worth it. So in this particular case, we are saving some slightly less than 10%. If we think that that's generally worth it, then we should go for it. You probably shouldn't invent, I mean, everybody of us can come up with something that's even more efficient with lots of bit twiddling and stuff. Probably shouldn't invent a third form. So for me, what the decision would be between sticking with this as a data structure that is expressed in CBOR, or carrying around a CoAP-like data structure, but then we would really follow the CoAP example. So we would actually use data encoding for the option number and so on. So it would be exactly like CoAP, except that the number space, of course, is different from the one we use for CoAP itself.
Will it really?
I didn't hear that.
Should it really, Christian? Be different.
Still not sure I understood you.
I was just wondering whether it really needs to be different, or whether I could just really literally copy those around into a CoAP header. Parts of it at least. But that's a detailed probably not for now.
Fun fact, before Coral was using CBOR, it was actually using the CoAP message format. Of course, not the same options, but the whole Coral document was basically a CoAP message formatted representation. But yeah, let's move on because we don't have a lot of time.
Let's have the last person in the queue. I think Jim was on the WebEx mentioning something.
Okay.
Jim, right.
Thank you very much. I understand you're right, Klaus. You're talking about using 5 bits to indicate a string length. Will that apply to the domain name component of a URL? Because the maximum length of a domain name will be considerably more than 32 bits, so 32 bytes.
Yes, so if we use 5 bits for the value length, then we're limited to up to 31 bytes. That's not a lot, I agree. On the other hand, we are assuming very constrained devices with very limited memory. So those devices probably won't be storing URLs with hundreds of bytes anyway. And so this might actually be in the ballpark of lengths that will be used in practice. But then again, we noticed a couple of times already in other protocols that putting in hard limits that are low like this eventually hurts us. So it's a difficult thing here to estimate what would be the right thing. I noticed in my implementation that I get a lot of benefits if the separators or these prefixes before the components have a fixed size. So if we use the CoAP message format and the delta encoding and all of that, we would, like in CBOR, have a variable length encoding of the number of bytes. And that would actually hurt my implementation a lot. So more to think about here.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. Maybe then we can continue on the next presentation. I think I can just start presenting, right? Just a second, sorry.
I had Corel itself no on the agenda.
No, 10-minute slot for all of these, basically.
Okay.
I wonder if we can, because basically we have to accommodate for the discussion, and it might be that we move some of the last drafts to another session and one of the interims, because we basically have 20 minutes left, 22 minutes. So Jim, if you can just go ahead with this discussion, please. Move. Jim? I don't hear you. Jim?
I have noise now?
Yes, now you have.
Okay, I just reconnected. One of the things that I've been trying to do is figure out exactly what the app structure looks like, because I keep wanting to actually write a document for an app, and it's just been kind of hard because nobody really knows. So it's really hard for me to see.
It's my mistake. I don't know what's going on with the presentation today. Slides.
So basically, what I want to try to do is get some more discussion started with a larger group of people. There's been a couple of us who have talked about this at various different times.
Now we have no slides. You have the wrong screen.
Sorry. Sorry, just a second. I'm just going to try to share the screen because there was a problem with the slides. If I just, you should be able to see this now.
Yes.
Next slide. So basically, what I'm trying to do in this presentation is basically talk about some things that we need input from and some different possible ways to go. The last item is something that Klaus keeps wanting to do, which is he'd like to be able to have these descriptions be machine readable. I'm more interested in making sure that they're actually usable and readable. So, but it's okay. Next slide. So the two basic methods that we want to look at as, and the ones that have been approached, is to basically write the app documents based upon links, which is what HTML documents are doing today. And the second is to basically go ahead and write it based on objects, the object-oriented programming world. I have a much better understanding personally of how to do the second than the first. So I'm not really too sure exactly what the first one would look like in a document, but I do know what the second would look like. In both cases, we really want to define some common definition stuff so that we can do things, we can write things once and not have to write them over and over in every document. Next slide. So by link basically is the standard thing what you're doing today. So you basically say, here's a link, and the relation type is this is a collection, and by the fact that you know it's a collection, or you know it has a specific interface defined, you know exactly how to interact with that, because and you can potentially put in multiple relations. So you could say, this is a collection which says this is how you would do get, this is how you do fetch. You could say that this is also deletable, which says that you know you can delete that item so it basically go through and list things that way. Next. The second is basically similar, but you're basically defining it on objects. So you're going to say, you know, this is a collection of items, and the item is basically a parameter that you can change. So that basically says you're going to support get and fetch. You can have an item that supports get and fetch. You can have a deletable item, which is inherits from an item, but it adds the definition of delete. Next. So the three applications that we have right now that we really need to write up and get going is the pub sub document, which has basically looked at trying to rewrite it into Coral, and they've got a new model, but they just haven't managed to get it written up. Reef, there's at least a couple of different versions of Reef running around there, but they all are basically the same thing. This is an application of how to talk to a resource directory. There's also over in the ACE working group, the group keying administration document, which basically is exactly the same thing. And when you look at these, they have a lot of commonalities. I mean, all of them have containers of objects. All of them have objects. So if we could write this common stuff down and get it written out in a way that's useful, and we don't have to repeat all the time, we're probably better off. Next. Okay. Okay. So, do people have comments? Do people have preferred ways of dealing with things in terms of what documents should look like? I know that we were all, if you've gone back and actually read the resource directory, Christian has basically rewritten the text on all of the interactions a couple of times to deal with, you know, how many errors do we need to do, how many errors do we not need to document, and so forth. Open for discussion.
I have the Etherpad, or I don't know if there's a queue, but I just want one question. Is it really simply just collection pattern versus object pattern, as you outlined in the earlier slides, or can you explain, is there a little more to it, or is that really the main dilemma here?
Those were the two patterns that Klaus and I and a couple of people came up with. There may be other patterns, and I'd be more than happy to, if you want to describe other patterns, I'd be more than happy to listen to them.
No, I think that makes sense. I mean, I guess it's they're all collections of links, but what do you want? How do you want to deal with the overall higher level resource that is represented by the collection itself? I think that's really what I was getting at, and whether that's really the core of the question.
I don't know if Jim, you want to reply, or if you want to.
No, I don't have a reply. I don't have a reply.
So I can say, as far as PubSub is concerned, that I feel that it would be nice to have some sort of high-level guidelines of how to do these applications, especially if we move into the Coral territory right now. That's my high-level thought. Maybe we move from the queue now. Thomas, you are there. Oops, wrong screen. Thomas, go ahead.
So an ignorant question. So could you please elaborate a bit on the difference and similarities, maybe with OpenAPI and Swagger, that you see?
No, because I don't know them well enough.
Okay, thanks.
The short answer here is that in OpenAPI, you specify which URLs are available and what operations on which URLs are possible. And if we use hypermedia, then we discover all the URLs from the server's responses. But basically, we would like to have something like OpenAPI, except we wouldn't have all the URLs in the file.
Okay, thanks.
I see. So this is the API template discussion. Thanks for clarifying that.
We have more time for this discussion, if anybody wants to comment. All right, so I guess maybe the discussion was cut a bit. I mean, I don't know, Jim, you wanna say some remarks basically before concluding, because I don't know if the people are too familiar with the. I mean, the group as a whole is familiar with the topic, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something we need to have talked about. The one other thing that potentially needs to be added to this is you still have potentially the reef content type schema to talk about, in addition to this list. I think I'll go ahead and try to write up something and mail it to the list and see if we get any more comments and discussion.
Yeah.
I think some idea of a proposal, and I think, you know, going along these lines, there are different ways of doing this, but I guess I agree we just need to come up with a common one. So maybe some proposals or some ideas of what one could look like.
Maybe like, so Jim, you can also maybe wait after one of the interims that we will have on applications anyways. And after that, maybe we have some more clarity on this topic.
Yeah, that makes sense too.
And then we have about 10 minutes left. So if we could maybe have problem details in 5 minutes and then versions in another, CML versions in another 5, that would be great. Sorry for the hassle. Otherwise, we can have it on a different interim. So just go ahead, Thomas.
So next, please. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So this is one proposal for another reporting format for web APIs. So it is very much based on a similar work that has been done in HTTP land with RFC 7807. It was published last November in Singapore, and it's gone through 2 iterations since. It's been presented in the core upside meeting in Singapore, where the sense of the room, if I haven't misinterpreted it, was that this might be useful work and worth pursuing. So we got good discussion, both offline with Karsten, Klaus, and obviously Jaime, who's co-authoring this, as well as on the mailing list with a nice review from Jim and further comments from Christian. So this is just to say that it's not been around for ages, but it's not completely new either. So maybe this is actually a good time to discuss what we want to do with that, with a wider group. The scope of this, hopefully very short presentation, is first recap a bit what the proposal is. Obviously, I'd recommend you go and read the draft as well. Second, to present some pending issues and questions. Third, to propose one specific way forward that we have discussed between the co-authors, which we informally call the co-organization, and you get the hint of that. And finally, discuss the draft, let's say, fate. Okay. So next, please. Okay, so the problem has this simple format with a global area and a local area. The global area contains code points of 2 sorts, those that allow precise error identifications, namespace and type, and the second category that comprises common fields that are likely to be shared across many errors, all errors, let's say. The variable part for those with an inclination towards ASN1 can be seen as an any defined binding space. So the keys defined here have scope meaning. So namespacing is used as one would expect as the semantic anchor. Right? So and these NS code points, namespace code points, can be either private if they're negatives, or public if positive. So the idea is that when and if an API goes public, renumbering happens by grabbing a public NS code point from the registry and maybe providing a spec document with that, but it is not mandatory. And the rest, by that I mean all the tags and any extension that comes with it stay the same. So basically, renumbering the renumbering operation consists of rerouting the semantic tree. Next, please. Okay, so let's see some open problems. So of an issue with localization, it has been highlighted by Jim. So is there anything we do to help here? Should we recommend the default language? As we stand, it looks like something can be done at least at the title level by mapping NSN type to a localized title string. But then the variable parts like details and any extensions are much more tricky to handle in more general case. Right? So as a note in Corel, localization of text strings can be done by nesting links of types language, if I remember correctly. Next, please. Next dash. Okay, so for reference here, you can look at Appendix B of RFC 6648. If you're interested, there's a good analysis on the problem there. But in a nutshell, the idea is that when moving from private to public, if the producer doesn't update, and therefore the private namespace sticks in the environment, all consumers, and by which I mean not just the core clients, but the whole logging pipeline, or at least significant chunks of it, they need to cope with that for an unbounded amount of time. Right? So the trouble here is that consumers don't seem to have much power in this tribal. So what could we say here? I don't know. I guess we should at least provide some guidance or discussion on strategies for minimizing the risk of this eternal pollution. Right? For example, recommend suit or whatever automated software update mechanism we prefer would be one thing, but maybe there's more to do that. Next, please. There was so there was a question from Jim. Jim suggested subsuming the diagnostic payload under the problem structure. So not for all diagnostic payload users, but at least for the extended tracing pattern, which seems to be very useful in both from an API developer point of view as well as the to diagnose pathological situations in the field. So we need to do that. We could do that very simply by adding a new optional diagnostic key in the global map, which we don't have at the moment. During the discussion in mailing list, Christian seemed a bit doubtful about that. His comment was the APIs that need something similar could add their own extension, and that is very true. In fact, grabbing a new code point in the local map is very cheap. It's a very cheap operation. So I think the question is this usage pattern going to be common and useful enough that it is worth factoring it out proactively or not? So is there an appetite for that? Next, please. Transition. Yes. So the idea Jaime, Klaus, and myself have been discussing is about moving this fully to Corel. If you do a pro-cons analysis, we have on the good side the fact that doing this would be technically superior in that it completely absorbs encoding, compression, and transfer variability, right? And there's the dual aspect as well, that from the Corel point of view, problem provides a full integrated and reusable building block that the Corel toolbox could use. On the con side, there's the dependency on Corel machinery. And the things to understand is how strong is the dependency. So can we make, for example, a minimalist implementation that is comparable in complexity with the current spec or not? And the other thing is the time dependency. So how long will it take to get it out? Which is really a question about Corel stability at this point in time, in a sense that how can we expect, when can we expect Corel moving, the moving parts of Corel to be stable enough, to become stable enough so that we can put this on top of that without problem. Next, please. So I think, yeah, there are three big questions I see here. First and foremost is whether standardization of a problem format is actually needed or not. Question. And subordinate to that is the question about, is the document in this shape ready for adoption or not? And third, as the bar invites us to ponder, is whether to quarrel or not to quarrel. I know how to answer the last one, but I'd like to hear from the rest of the group. Cheers.
Thank you, Thomas. Before going, thank you for the presentation. Very good. Before going into the queue, I would like to quickly ask who has read the draft on the, you can answer on the WebEx or on the Jabber. Just to be aware of how many. I mean, my gut feeling is about 5, 6 people maybe. Okay. And then continue on the Jabber. And then if you could also mention in the Jabber now who will be in favor of adopting this draft in core without whether to Coral or not to Coral. We may go for link format. I mean, I would prefer Coral, obviously. You know, it's up to the group. And I see only plus, well, apart from the authors, I suppose. I see 3, 4. Well, 6 maybe for Jabber. I cannot see the WebEx, so we will count it later. Either way, this will go to the list, but at least now I get an impression of who's interested in this. And now we can go to the queue. And I think it was Michael on it.
I'm all for adopting. I would use it elsewhere. I'll just comment that maybe we want to wordsmith the title or the draft name. Every time I read core COAP problem, I think that there's a problem with COAP. And I have to remember this is about something else. So that just maybe would be a good.
Maybe something with description or
yeah.
I get what you mean. Yep. Any other comments in the queue? Because we are, I mean, my clock says 29, so I guess we will not have SNML. So we might as well just dig deeper on this one.
Jaime, there is a time aspect on the SNML thing. So yes. Moving this forward again is not going to work. So I just need one bit here. Can we start working group adoption call for the thing on the mailing list now?
You're talking about versions?
Yes.
Yeah, I can ask the group again the same question. Who has read the SNML versions? Just plus 1 on red on the chat, either Jabber or Ari. You cannot vote twice. I can say myself I have read and I think it's useful. Also on WebEx, please. Okay, and I assume, I mean, so, and those who have read it, who will be in favor of adoption? Okay, so we have 2, 4, 5. Okay, would be, I mean, any one of those who have read it would be against adoption. Okay, so I mean, this document is actually rather simple. It's a shame we didn't have the time for the presentation. We can send it to the list, but I mean, this is something we need. We have been discussing it before with the SNML units. We have had a lengthy discussion with the AD. And this was a comment that basically was voiced out, and the document itself is rather simple. So I think we should adopt it, but maybe we want to keep, you know, some discussion or a lot of some discussion open at least for how we do the versioning, which at the moment is novel to me the way we do it. I haven't seen it before, and it has a limitation. I don't know if the hard limit for the versions were 49 or 50. So basically, it's a different way than we have done versioning elsewhere. But so basically we have in total, I'm trying to read from the Etherpad which number we have, by the way, if somebody could write it down, the total number for adoption.
6 supporting adoption in total, yeah.
Okay, that sounds enough. So let's call for adoption on this one. We will send it to the main list and then people will be able to discuss it there as well.
Thank you.
Sorry again for the lack of time. We didn't maybe think this through. We were too ambitious on the timing. Sorry for that. We'll have a lot of interims to discuss.
Everybody can read my slides, which are out there. And I think we should have a technical discussion in the next interim meeting, which is when?
End of April, right? I don't know, actually. I don't remember by heart.
April 29.
Yes,
Exactly.
Great.
Any other issues, any other comments? We have a flex time of -2. Then thank you very much, guys, for your time, and hope to see you again in the interims.
Cheers, bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.